Welcome to our webinar today, Getting Back to the Basics of Hours of Service, brought to you by Fleet Complete and Big Road. My name is Josh, and if you haven't already done so, please feel free to grab a snack or a cup of coffee and enjoy the presentation. In today's webinar, our Fleet Complete Big Road subject matter expert, Marc Moncion, is going to cover getting back to the basics of hours of service and more. Now, I did want to also point out as well that we've had an incredible turnout for this webinar, actually about 500 registrants. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today. Many of you here have attended our previous webinars, but if not, this slide here will give you a high-level understanding of Marc's corporate profile and background. Please note that you can connect with Marc through our Ask the Expert blogs, found on both our Fleet Complete and Big Road websites. Now, if you own a truck or a driver or are a driver with a question, Marc likely has the answer for you. If not, he will get you the answer. Also, as a reminder to everyone here in attendance, I'll be recording today's webinar, and we will send you an email with the recording shortly after this event. Now, over to you, Marc.
All right, well, thank you very much, Josh, for the warm welcome. Just so you know, I purposely picked the Smokey and the Bandit song just because this movie was produced prior to the introduction of the hours of service regulation. Back in the day, truck drivers essentially would self-monitor fatigue and would many times drive until their eyes couldn't stay open. If you haven't seen the movie, it's as follows. Bo Bandit Darville, played by Burt Reynolds, and Cletus Snowman Reed played a tandem. They were buddies. They took a bet from Big and Little Enos Burdette. And the bet was that they couldn't transport 4,000 cases of Coors beer from Texarkana, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia. This was a feat that would require a lot of illegal driving, violations of hours of service, not to mention the smuggling of the beer. While the Snowman's driving the truck carrying the beer, the Bandit drives a Pontiac Trans Am with Carrie Frog, played by Sally Field. And their goal is to distract the enforcement attention to take them away from Snowman, who can deliver the freight. During their run, they're pursued by the hilarious Texas County Sheriff, Buford T. Justice, who's played by Jackie Gleason, and his son, Junior. At the time was engaged to Carrie, but Carrie bailed on him and went to go with the Bandit instead. This is a classic movie, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest you tune in it because it's a great movie. So moving on, those of you who have listened to other ELD webinars and hours of service webinars, you'll note that I'm changing gears here. Why? Well, essentially, as I speak to clients, I've come to find that more and more, there seems to be an apparent misunderstanding with the hours of service regulation. And this is really both sides of the border. Now, this is understandable because if you don't live and breathe the rules such as I, it is one of the most complex regulations to understand. You want to add to the mix the variance between the federal rules, the state rules, the provincial rules, the territorial rules. It's kind of a mix all across the map. So that makes it rather complicated. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, the rules will be much clearer to you. And again, if I don't answer your question today, just reach out to me at Ask the Expert. It would be my pleasure to answer. My goal today is I'm going to introduce starting off the basic, what is a commercial motor vehicle? Because it's defined differently in both countries. I'm then going to highlight some hours of service exemptions that drivers can take advantage of. Now, really, when you get to the core of things, there's really three basic rules everybody must follow unless otherwise exempt. So I'm going to highlight what these are. I'm also going to explain what is considered a work shift, what is considered on duty and off duty time, what are some of the rest options, what is considered a yard move, some important differences between personal use and personal conveyance in Canada. And then I'm going to talk about, this is a real made in Canada specific, it's a deferral rule. Now it cannot be used in the United States. At that point, I'm going to talk a little bit about driver cycles, how the sleeper berth rules are managed a little bit differently in both countries. You'll come to find the biggest difference on that front is that in Canada, you have a single and you have team driving, and they both have different privileges. Thereon, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's an emergency, as we've all lived this with COVID, and how that's different than adverse driving conditions, because there are some significant differences there. Thereafter, I'm going to talk about what are the contents of a daily log, both from a paper log, an electronic log, an AOBRD, or an ELD. After that, we're going to talk about some specific driver and carrier responsibilities, as well as penalties that are associated for non-compliance. At the end of the document in this webinar, you'll notice I'm going to have a quick reference guide. It's basically I've consolidated everything into some bullets comparing the Canada South of 60 rules, as well as the US property rules for commercial drivers. So with that, at the end of the session, after the conclusion, we'll open it up for whatever time we have for a Q&A. So just kicking it off, as is always the case, I have tons of information, so let's get going. In Canada, the federal hours of service rules are defined in SOR 2005-313. There's a similar rule in the United States under Part 395. Just so you know, these are federal rules and they are applicable to extra-provincial and interstate carriers moving passengers and goods going from one province to another, province to a territory, province to a state, and vice versa. Of course, there's also provincial, territorial, and state rules. These rules have adopted some of the federal rules, but in some cases, as you can expect, they want their own little special little sandbox just to be a little bit different. With the challenges, drivers must comply with all of these rules concurrently. While in Canada, going to the United States, they have to comply in the jurisdiction in question. Now, in terms of history, hours of service were really introduced in the late 1980s. Coincidentally, this is the period of time where yours truly started my career in the industry. So you get an idea of what my tenure is in the transportation field. These regulations were written to provide professional truck drivers and motor coach operators with maximum driving time, minimum limits for rest, when they can be on duty, what is considered a day, a work shift, and a cycle. Now, in terms of a commercial motor vehicle, it's defined differently. In Canada, it's a truck, tractor, trailer, or a combination of these with a registered gross weight of greater than 4,500 kilograms. That's essentially what you're paying for as a registration to turn your wheels on a highway. In terms of exemptions, there's a few of them. You'll see there's a lot more in the United States. You got some 2- and 3-axle vehicles hauling primary farm and forest seed products. The carrier has to be the producer of the product. They have to be returning from their trip. There's also some exemptions for emergency vehicles and vehicles engaged in providing relief. And we saw this again during COVID, and there were these emergency declarations on both sides of the border. In terms of the key exemption that I want to really hone in on for Canada is the short haul driver. This is where the driver is operating within the radius of 160 kilometers. That driver returns to his home terminal each day and takes 8 consecutive hours of core rest. In such cases, the driver is exempt. And let me be clear, the exemption is for surrendering the record of duty status log at roadside. They're not exempt from having records. This condition includes, now the motor carrier that employs the driver has to have accurate records. The time the driver starts, the time the driver ends his duty status, what cycle they're on, and these records have to be kept for a period of 6 months. If the motor carrier is not complying with these requirements, even though the driver is staying within the radius, they must complete a log. It's as simple as that. I'll give you the example. In the old days, for those of you who know me, I was an on-road officer. I was also a facility auditor. When I would stop a vehicle at roadside and the driver would say, look, I'm within the 160, I'm going back home at the end of the day, I would say, that's good, no issue there. If I found there was something problematic with that carrier, I would merely schedule an audit. At the time of the audit, I would ask the motor carrier, I stopped driver Marc Moncion. He didn't have a log. I want your accurate records for that driver. If the driver, you don't have records for that, that is a violation for both the driver, who now needs a log, and also the motor carrier who doesn't have accurate records. So this is why a number of big road clients, even though they're operating within this radius, they forego the exemption and they merely go ahead with our solution, with the caveat they don't have to surrender that record to the officer at roadside. All right, so hopefully that was clear. In the United States, there's a little bit different. They have this 8 and 30-day rule for those of you that travel north-south. So basically in the United States, if they go outside their radius, they can do so for 8 and a moving 30-day window and still not required to comply with ELD as an example. That is not the case in Canada. If you're over the 160 one day, you require fully regulated log. In terms of the United States, definition is a little bit different. Still a truck, a tractor, or a trailer. Everything's an imperial, so 10,001 pounds. It's pertaining to the gross weight rating or the combination. So the weight in the truck, if you're pulling with a trailer, of course, the weight with the trailer, or if you're hauling hazardous material in a quantity that requires placarding. If that's the case, you're fully regulated. Now, in terms of exemptions, the United States has far more than in Canada, and it's based on a number of factors. It includes where the driver is going, the goods that they're carrying, whether they're responding to an emergency or not, or if they're carrying a specific commodity that is typically exempt. So I could spend the rest of this webinar just talking about these specific types of exemptions, but I want to focus on the 150. This again is air miles, so the radius from where they start to report. Now, for those of you in the industry as long as it used to be 100 miles. The US government added another 50, so it's 150 miles now. The US government also added an additional 2 hours. So it used to be 12 hours on duty to return home. Now it's up to 14 hours. The thing I want to stress is if the driver elects to sleep in his truck or goes to a motel and not return home, even though they're within the 150, they need a log now. Another unique feature, I touched upon it, is that 8 and 30 rule. That is not something that can be used in Canada. So if someone's crossing the border, say in Buffalo going to Fort Erie, and they go outside the 150 for that one day, as soon as they're in Canada, when they're over the 160, they must comply with the rules in Canada. So I wanted to stress that. And also, there'll be full enforcement. We've all heard about the ELD rule, June 12, 2021. There's that 12-month educational period. I have a whole dedicated webinar that I talked about that. So there's no enforcement on the ELD front, but there clearly is enforcement in Canada on hours of service. So be mindful of that. So this, I'll give you back to our driver in the US. In this short haul, the driver has to take at least 8 hours off, or if it's a motor coach moving passengers, it's 10 hours off if they operate. As is the case in the United States, in Canada, the same thing for the motor carrier, needing all the different types of accurate records in terms of time cards. All right. Finally, as I said, the motor carrier has to keep these records, same thing as in Canada, for a period of 6 months. Now, in terms of the 3 basic rules, pretty straightforward. You have daily rules, you have work shift rules, and you have cycle rules. I'll explain these in greater detail for both jurisdictions. So let's start in Canada. In Canada, a day is defined as a 24-hour period that is designated by your employer. And that goes for the duration of your cycle, quite different than in the United States. So if your motor carrier does not designate a specific time, it'll always default, and common is midnight to midnight. And that's what you'd see on a graph grid. So that would continue to be the case until there was a reset. This is quite different in the US, as I'll explain later. So during a specific cycle, the driver can start his day at a different time, and that becomes their work shift. Their work shift is essentially what is the first active duty status they do on their log at the start of their day. Finally, as I alluded to above, the only way for a driver to change their definition of a day is if they have the proper reset based on the 2 cycles that I'll be talking about later on in the presentation. In the United States, the day is not defined in Part 395. In this case, what they do for the DOT purposes is the driver is afforded a 14-day driving window to drive 11 hours maximum and 14 hours on duty maximum. Therefore, a driver is not allowed to drive after the 14th hour. The other thing is the driver has to take a minimum of 10 hours off in order to restart their shift. As I said earlier, Canada is 8. In the United States, it's 10. Much like in Canada, the driver can start their work shift at different times every day, but it must be indicated on their log. Now, in terms of daily requirements in Canada, this is essentially what an officer, an auditor will look to see as your output file. So whatever's listed on your log for that 24-hour period, the driver must have a minimum of 10 hours off every day. The driver must also have a minimum of 8 core hours of rest. Now, of that 8 hours, there's an additional 2 to make 10 in the day. How that's formed is drivers will take off-duty periods, which must be at least 30 minutes in length. Now, you're never going to want to stop a driver from taking a break if the driver wants to take a break. So in this case, if a driver takes like a 20-minute break, that's not going to count towards the 10-hour off in the day. So from my perspective, if a driver is going to take a break, you may as well take half an hour, because anything less than 30 minutes, it won't count. The same thing, 10 hours rest, 13 hours driving, 14 hours on duty, and 16 hours of elapsed time. Those are the daily requirements. This is what the officer, the auditor is going to look at. So think of the elapsed time. I like to call it the sands of the hourglass. So the driver starts his day at 6 a.m. At 6 a.m., you start counting 16 hours forward. Regardless of what the driver is doing during that day, the sands are turned over and the sand is depleting. At the 16th hour or at 10 p.m., all driving must stop. And that's basically it. Now, in terms of the United States, some similarities but differences. First thing I pointed out was the 10 consecutive hours off instead of 8. The second, and this was an amendment recently in the government, the 30-minute break at the 8th hour. Before, it used to be from the 8th hour you started on duty. Now it's the 8th hour of cumulative driving. So a little bit more flexibility for the driver. So it softened it. And the other thing that's key for a driver to know is this 30 minutes can be broken down in off-duty time, in the sleeper berth, or even on duty, not driving, unloading freight. You can still count that as your off-duty time. Next, a driver in that 14-day window can only drive a maximum of 11 and must not drive after being on duty for 14 hours. So it's kind of, the 14 hour is like Canada's 16-hour elapse with 2 hours less. So next we'll talk about work shifts. Work shifts is basically after the driver takes 8 consecutive hours of core rest, and it ends after the next 8 hours of core rest. So it's really simple as that. And the work shift says the driver after the 8 hours of core rest can start driving. So the driver can continue to work for the motor carrier after the 8th hour. They can unload, they can offload freight, they can do a pre-trip, they can fill in their paperwork, they can talk to dispatch. But the thing is they cannot do is they cannot drive. Simple as that. Again, as I've said earlier, for illustration purposes, I put these 3 stop signs on the grid: 13 hours driving, 14 hours on duty, 16 hours elapsed, all that in a work shift. So the next one I want to talk about is the work shift rules in Canada. Again, I'm a visual person, so I wanted to put this infographic. So you see a driver starting his shift at 2 a.m. He goes and does his pre-trip for half an hour. You start counting that 16 hours forward until 1800 hours or 6 p.m. That is the end of the shift. So that's the 16 hours. As you can see on the grid, no driving after the 13th hour and no on-duty driving after the 14th hour. In the United States, the only variance is the 2 additional hours of core rest that's needed in that work shift. All right, so it's really simple as that. In the U.S., the work shifts are different, the 2 extra hours. Again, as I said earlier, the driver can do other active work on behalf of the driver, but just can't be behind the wheel driving. Again, for illustration purposes, you can see on this next slide, there's 2 stop signs. And these 2 stop signs are basically the 11-hour and the 14-hour rule, no driving after that. So we're quite similar, except the elapsed rule is 2 hours less than in Canada. Now, in terms of work shift rules, again, same type of infographic. I'm showing you the graph grid. In this case, the driver starts to shift at 6 a.m. That's when the sands of the hourglass starts. You count 14 hours up until 2000 hours or 8 p.m., and that's the end of that driver's shift. In this case, 14 hours. So no driving after the 11th hour and no driving after being on duty for 14. Next, I want to talk to you about is on-duty time. I get asked this question pretty regularly, so I thought it'd be important. I want to explain what is meant by that. This is essentially when a driver starts performing work on behalf of the employer or is available to work, except if the driver is waiting to be assigned work. This on-duty time continues until the driver is relieved of responsibility. Otherwise, on duty, fairly simple. They're inspecting, servicing, repairing, conditioning, fueling, starting the vehicle, traveling in a commercial motor vehicle as a co-driver with no sleeper berth, if you're loading or unloading freight, if you're checking your load, if you're waiting before and while your vehicle is being serviced for maintenance, this is all on duty time. Continuing on, if you're waiting while a vehicle or the load is being inspected by a safety official, on duty time. If you're at an in-transit point because of an accident or an unplanned occurrence or situation, this is on duty time unless, just the light comes on, you may want to consider adding adverse conditions in this point. Otherwise, it's on duty. If you're resting or you're occupying a vehicle for any other purpose other than traveling, on duty time. For the driver in this specific instance, he must be at the request of the motor carrier spending time as a passenger by any mode of destination. So once you get to your place of destination, if the driver takes 8 consecutive hours upon arrival and doesn't start to drive when they're a passenger, when they arrive, if they're going off duty, they can book that as off duty. Otherwise, if they start driving once they reach their destination, that time as a passenger must be counted as on duty driving. All right. Next, performing any work for a motor carrier. So if the motor carrier is asking you to do something, whether paid or not, if you're doing something active, that's on duty. If you're doing a yard move, if you're shunting trailers, if you're positioning loads, this is all on duty time. All right. Now, let's move on to off duty. Off duty is essentially the time spent where the driver stops to work. The driver's relieved of responsibility. He's in a sleeper berth. He's spending time in a stationary vehicle to satisfy the requirements of at least 2 hours off. Does not form part of the 8 consecutive hours off in Canada or 10 consecutive hours off in the U.S. That could be spent as off-duty time. Next, I want to talk about yard moves. Again, get questions on that. The vehicle must be operating on what is not considered a highway. So if it's a highway, it has to be private property. It can't be public access. There has to be something to point out private property. The driver would then manually select yard move. Even though they're driving, they would manually select on duty, not driving in a yard move. We have that feature in Big Road. This time will work against the driver's on duty clock, but not the driving clock. Also, if driving is accidentally indicated for yard move, then the driver would have to annotate that they are actually on private property doing yard moves. Next one I want to talk about is personal use, different between Canada and the U.S. In Canada, personal use in the Great White North, this is actually one of those scenarios where we are a little bit more restrictive. And the reason being is that in Canada, personal use is written right in the regulation, whereas in the United States, it is a guidance document from FMCSA. So in Canada, if you want to take advantage of personal use, there's certain factors you have to comply with. You can't be conducting business. Your vehicle has to be unloaded, completely unladen. And you also have to be bobtailing. You can't be pulling a trailer. You cannot go over 75 kilometers in a day. And we talked a little about what the definition of a day was earlier. And the driver is to record start and end odometer readings. That is mandated. In the United States, it's different. It's by guidance. And they've softened up the rules in the United States. And this came about as a result. Drivers were having trouble finding places of rest after delivering their loads, and they were actually going over their hours. So the US government adopted more soft measures in the United States. First, again, relieved of responsibility. In this case, the vehicle can be loaded fully or partially, can be pulling a trailer, and there's no distance limit in the United States. All right. So I want to highlight some examples where drivers can use what they call in the US personal conveyance, actually. When a driver has ended his day and is traveling en route to a motel or a truck stop to get rest. When a driver is commuting from his terminal to his residence, between trailer drops, between work sites and their residence, traveling to a nearby location to get rest, not a motel, maybe just by the side of the road. Moving a vehicle at the request of a safety official when off duty. So if the officer says, I need you to move, you can stay off duty. If you're transporting personal property while off duty, if you're using a commercial motor vehicle to get home at the end of your shift, these are all acceptable personal conveyance examples in the United States. What is not acceptable by the US government is you can't move your vehicle to enhance operational readiness. So by that, I mean, you can't bypass a rest area to go to another location that's going to get you closer to your next load. That doesn't count. If you're delivering a towed unit and the towed unit no longer meets the definition of vehicle and the driver returns to his point of origin at the direction of your boss, that can't be claimed as personal conveyance. If you're continuing a trip in interstate commerce to fulfill a business purpose, even though you're bobtailing or operating with an empty trailer, if you're doing that to go position yourself for another load, that is not personal conveyance. If you spend time driving as a passenger carrying commercial motor vehicle, so you're on board, this is a motor coach, your off duty is not considered when passengers have even gotten off the bus. If you still have cargo on the bus and you're transporting this cargo to a facility. If you're driving your vehicle to a maintenance facility to get repairs, that is not personal conveyance. If you're placed out of service by a safety official and they say, you know, you're done, you cannot book yourself personal conveyance. You're basically grounded right there. And if you're traveling to a motor carrier's terminal after loading or unloading and you're going back to get another load, that is not personal conveyance as well. And the last point I talked a little bit was the luggage part. So really the challenge for truck drivers is because of these different personal use and conveyance rules, Canada and the US, while in the US, you can comply with the US conveyance rules. But if you happen to go north-south and you're coming back into Canada, you have to comply with the Canadian rule while in Canada. So that it makes it a little bit tricky. Next, I want to talk about is the deferral rule. I want to start off by saying this rule is only applicable in Canada. US drivers in the US cannot use this rule. US drivers, I would discourage you from even using it in Canada because it'll muff up your time really. So this has been in place for some time, but it doesn't really get used that much. I get questions asked and there's a lot of misunderstandings, but so people don't want to take a chance. They don't want to get a citation. So most people don't use it, but I'm going to explain it to you anyway. So essentially a driver can defer a maximum of 2 hours of their daily off-duty time from day 1 to day 2. So what you're doing is you're basically pushing your time to the next day. The driver has to declare the deferral in their log. You have to mark it in the exemption and the remarks because it's not seen very often. And you don't want to get into a debate with the officer at roadside. So make sure you annotate it. So to ensure compliance, you must understand that you can exercise the day deferral from 1 to 2, but it cannot be part of the mandatory 8 consecutive hours of core rest. You cannot do that. Otherwise, the other conditions are the off-duty time in those 2 days cannot be less than 20 hours. The maximum deferred time is 2. You can't drive more than 26 hours in those 2 days. And understandably, the deferral rule can be used every other day. But you have to be careful because as you're deferring time, you must be still mindful of your cycles because at some point you're likely going to go run your cycle. So you're going to steal from Peter to take from Paul. So unless you have a clear understanding of what you're doing over multiple days, you want to be mindful how you're using this deferral rule. All right. And at the very end, as I said, annotate. You always annotate. You always add a remark just to protect yourselves. Next, I want to talk about some cycles. This is the third component of the 3 rules. The countries, Canada, the US, you both have 2 cycles. In Canada, a driver can work under cycle 1. That is the more common of the cycles. It's based on 70 hours and 7 days. And a driver, in order to reset, as I talked about earlier, if you want to reset your day, you want to reset your cycle, you want to start your definition of a day differently, you have to take 36 consecutive hours off. There's also the second cycle, cycle number 2. That is more for your east-west motor carriers. We have a lot of clients that use this cycle too. They go northwest or they go to east-west, sorry. So in this one, the on-duty time is capped at 120 hours in 14 days. In order to reset, start your day differently, you have to take 24 consecutive hours off. And the other requirement is you must take at a minimum 24 consecutive hours off before the 70th hour. As I said, in the US, also 2 cycles, but the times are a little bit different. For the first one, If your company does not operate commercial motor vehicles every day of the week, you're not allowed, you take the 60-hour and 7-day cycle, all right? So essentially on the 60th hour, the driver can't drive in 7 days. This becomes like a moving window. One day, day 1 till 7, day 2 till 8, day 3 till 9. As in the case, drivers can do more work, but they cannot drive after over their cycles. That's where the violations occur. If they actually put you on the road after a cycle, that's where you can have a problem. Now, if your company does operate vehicles every day of the week, you'd select the 70-hour and 8-day schedule. That means after the 70th hour in an 8-day window, moving window, you cannot drive after the 70th hour. Still do other work, but you can't drive. So that's kind of it. In terms of resets, for both cycles in the US, it's a 34 consecutive hours off. Whether you're on cycle 1 or cycle 2, it's 34 hours off. Now, in addition, drivers, you can do more work. I've talked about that. You simply can't drive the commercial motor vehicle. Now, I'm going to move on to sleeper berth. Again, a little bit different. Generally speaking, the sleeper berth grants a driver the privilege of splitting up their daily off-duty time into 2 periods, all right? As I explained before, this would be by taking a minimum of 8 consecutive hours off before driving. The only difference is that the rest is taken in a sleeper as opposed to a person going home into their own bed or to a motel. What is unique to Canada is they have a team and single driver environment. A single driver has to take 8 hours off duty, but the times may be split into 2 periods, provided no period is less than 2 hours. Team drivers, a little bit different. It's not 10, it's 8 hours that they split, and it's in 2 periods again, but in this case, in periods of not less than 4 hours. So a driver taking advantage of the sleeper berth, I want you to understand you still have to comply with the basic daily rules. And that's why I want to talk about day rules. 13 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours, 10 hours off duty. That still has to show up in the day. These daily maximums are calculated. What you really have to do is you have to look at the time prior to the qualifying rest and the time after the qualifying rest. Those 2 times together cannot exceed those maximums. The sleeper berth times, the qualifying rests have to be 8 hours for teams, 10 hours for single. All right, so that's why I want to emphasize that. The last thing I want to emphasize is the sleeper berth has to be properly manufactured, designed in a tractor. So if a driver is going to sleep on their steering wheel, sleep on the bench, like that's not going to count as sleeper berth time. So again, I'm visual, so I've got the next slide. It's a single driver's graph. As you can see, the first qualifying rest of the sleeper is 3 hours. It's between 4:15 and 7:15 a.m. The second qualifying rest, as you can see, is 7 hours between 1:15 p.m. and 8:15 p.m. The total rest between the two is 10 hours. And then prior to the first rest, which is driving from midnight to 4 a.m., and then the qualifying rest, the driver then resumes after the qualifying rest until he starts the second qualifying rest. So in this case, prior to the first qualifying rest and before the second, the driver doesn't go over 13 hours driving, 14 hours on duty, or 16 hours elapsed time. So fully compliant. Next, visual depiction of the team driver. Again, as you can see, the first qualifying rest in this grid is between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. So he's taking his 4 hours. The driver then takes the second qualifying rest, another 4 hours, between 1 p.m. and 6 p.m. The total of the 2 qualifying rests is 8 hours. Prior to the first qualifying rest, the driver is driving from midnight to 4 p.m. After the first qualifying rest, resumes driving, then goes back for the second qualifying rest at 1 p.m. Therefore, he has not exceeded the 13 and 14 or 16 hours in between those 2 qualifying rests. So in the United States, a little bit different. They don't have team, and you can still ride teams, of course, but you're not afforded the same privileges as you are in Canada. You have a 10-hour split between the two. What the U.S. government has done is they've recently amended their sleeper berth rules to make them a little bit more flexible. So by way of quick review, 10 hours of sleeper berth time. The short rest, which is kind of really flexible, is It can be in or out of the sleeper berth, but it must be at least 2 hours. The second, which is the long rest, must be at least 7 hours, and this one must be in the berth. The total is 10 hours. So I want to emphasize, because people ask me this now, it could be 7 and 3 to make 10. It could be 7.5 and 2.5 to make 10. It could be 7 3/4 hours and 2 2/4 hours to make 10. It could be a combination of any one of those, as long as it adds up to 10. In addition, important to know, when you add these 2 qualifying rests, they don't count towards your 14-hour driving window. The sleeper berth does not count towards this window. But there's also that same qualifying rest. So I'm talking to you about, as you get after the 8th hour of driving, a driver still needs to take 30 minutes off in there. So don't forget that part. So moving on to the next slide, just the same daily requirements as I talked about earlier. Can't drive more than 11 hours in a 14-hour day. You can't be driving after the 14th hour of being on duty, and you have to take a minimum of 10 hours off. So that's pretty well it on that. Finally, the sleeper berth, again, no sleeping on the steering wheel or the bench. So again, for illustrative purposes, I've got 2 examples here. On this, I'm going to make the assumption that the driver has started day 1 with a fresh clock. So that, by that, I mean they've taken 8 consecutive hours off. They've taken a 34-hour reset. None of these 4 breaks and these 2 examples will count towards the moving 14-hour driving window. You got to look at either side of the qualifying rest to see if the driver complies with the sleeper berth rules or not. And that's with respect to the 11 and the 14 hours. So in example 1, you see the driver from midnight to 7 a.m. That's the first active period, driving and on duty. The driver then gets 1 + 6, so 7 hours of on duty in that first active period. The time between 7 and 10 as off duty does not count towards the clock. This is the first qualifying rest of 3 hours. Then you start counting the second active period from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. There's then again the 2 hours off on duty, not driving between 7 and 9, followed by 5 hours of driving between 12 p.m. and 5 p.m. So a total of 7 hours on duty for that second active period. The first active period of 6 plus the second active period of 5 adds up to 11 hours of driving. No more than 14 hours on duty. He's got his qualifying rests between the 2, so he's good to go. In terms of example number 2, it's pretty similar in terms of the breakdown, except in sample number 2, you're using a 7 and 3 split. So I just want to highlight that. I'm not going to go forensically every grid passage there, but you can see visually the driver, again, hasn't exceeded the 11 hours or the 14 hours and has taken the proper qualifying rest on either side. Next, I want to move on to emergencies. This is something I want to explain because there's federal, provincial, state, local emergencies that can be called. Things such as what happened with COVID, when motor carriers and drivers, some were granted relief from their hours of service. These were drivers that were carrying specific goods that were supporting the emergency. So there's really 2 types of scenarios you want to look at. The first is a driver's on the road, he's driving along, dispatch advises, look, there's an emergency. In that case, the driver is exempt for hours of service to reach their safe destination. Once they get to their destination, the emergency conditions for that specific driver is lifted unless they're contributing to the emergency by transporting certain goods or something to alleviate the emergency. The second, and really important, is you always annotate. In the second example, this is where the driver is actually providing relief. In this case, the hours of service is lifted until the emergency is lifted. And this was what took place in March of last year. A little bit different when you're talking about adverse driving. Adverse driving, again, a little different Canada and the U.S., but it's used when drivers encounter unforeseen conditions, snow, sleet, fog, adverse road conditions, something that wasn't known to the driver or the carrier dispatching the driver before the event took place. If that's the case, the driver can extend their 13 hours of driving, their 14 hours of on duty, and reducing their 2 hours of daily off time. Once that driver reaches the point of safety, the driver is obliged to take the 8 consecutive hours. Finally, the driver, as I've said multiple times now, you always annotate the condition in your log. That will take away the mystery or the debate after the fact. So I've included a couple of charts here visually on this next slide, and it just shows you the top chart, adverse driving. You got 13 plus you can add another 2 hours to make 15. On duty, you can add 2 hours to the 14 to make 16 hours on duty. And then you can reduce your off duty from 10 hours minus 2 to 8 hours. On the bottom chart, that's just the work shift. And the work shift is the start of the driver's day, as I talked about, after taking core rest. Again, 15 hours driving, 16 hours on duty. The one thing that's very important is the government will not allow you to go beyond 16 hours of elapsed time in the South of 60 rule in Canada. In the United States, there was amendments to their driving condition rules. In the past, the driver wasn't included in the equation, which I thought was kind of unfair. But in this new rule, the driver or the dispatch, if they encounter the same types of conditions, sleep, fog, adverse road conditions, snow, ice, traffic conditions. In this case, the driver also has leeway now in the United States. So I just want to show you the next chart on how this works. In the past, the driver was granted an exception to the 10 hours and the 11 hours of driving when these conditions occurred. In the old rule, it didn't extend the 14-hour driving window though. In this new world, it extends the 14-hour window to 16. So this also applies to motor coach. And incidentally, the motor coach is 15 hours, so they can extend their 2 hours to 17 in the United States. So much like previous, I got a slide here I'll show you. So say a driver is, say, 15 miles from his destination, and there's a gravel spill, there's something happening on the like a water bridge. They can't get across the bridge. That's the only access to get to their destination. The driver has 1 hour left on their 14-hour window. In this case, the driver can stop at the next exit because he knows the bridge is out. And then once the road gets cleared 2 hours later, they can continue on their journey and make it within that 14-hour window. In the U.S., it's not mandatory, but I'm going to say it again anyway. Annotate that event. Always want to annotate. Next, I want to talk about contents of the log because, you know, in the United States, you have ELD. In Canada, it's coming, but there's specific content requirements, whether you're using a paper log, electronic log, AOBRD, ELD. With the Big Road solution, as soon as you select the proper rule on your device, it'll automatically update what is needed in the output file for the document. But here's a couple of differences. So we'll begin with the start of your day. So at the start of the day, pure and simple, the driver indicates the start of their day if it's not midnight. If there are any co-drivers, you got to include that. You got to declare what cycle you're on. You got to input your license number of the vehicle and trailer. You got to put your odometer reading at the start. You got to list your carrier's name, their place of business, and your home terminal. In the remarks section, if in Canada, you need to describe if you're using the deferral or not. In the remarks section, if you are operating previously in the last 7 days in the United States or last 14 days in Canada, and then all of a sudden you're not exempt, you need to indicate in the remarks section the on-duty, off-duty, and total duty times for those previous days, in addition to the log that you have to complete. So now I want to move on to what you need to do during the day. This is basically updating your record of duty status after every change, all right? So this is based on those 4 categories that are listed on the log. Off-duty in the sleeper. Driving, on duty, not driving. Failure to maintain to the last change in duty status can and will result in a violation. The driver also has to indicate location changes every time the change of status occurs. Municipality, province, state, highway. In Canada, unique, you have to indicate start and ending odometer reading if you're using personal use. The reason for that is the regulator wants to know that you haven't gone over your 75 kilometers in that day. That is not the case for personal conveyance in the US. So essentially, drivers want to annotate any extensions. If you're in an emergency, if you're in adverse, the golden rule is protect yourself, put in the remarks. The last piece of the equation is the driver at the end of the day. That is tallying up your hours. It must, of course, equal 24. You have to tally up the odometer readings. You have to tally up the personal use readings. You have to sign and certify your log. It has to be done every day, 365 days a year. If you're not driving, you still have to account every day because you're certifying that you're not working on those days and you have to sign off on it. All right. In terms of carrier responsibilities, I want to share that both the driver and the motor carrier equally share responsibility. The fines and penalties associated with these violations, they're linked to how severe they are, how egregious they are, whether the driver or the motor carrier is a repeat offender. If there's additional circumstances, and by that I mean if a driver has been involved in an accident and it's found that they're over their hours or they falsified their hours, the fines, the penalties will be much higher. Think only of what happened, the very, very unfortunate incident with Humboldt. The driver was falsifying his log. There were multiple fatalities. It saddened me. You can understand, like, the driver was treated very, very harshly, fines, jail time, and deportation. So that being said, the typical fine is in the range of $250 to $20,000, and you can go to jail for up to 6 months or a combination of both. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm not going to go in detail on these because I know we're starting to run on time. But these are 3 slides, and I call them the Canada reference guides, U.S. Canada. It just basically describes everything I've talked about, but in a chart form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit to putting these charts on our homepage. So you just have to go to Marc's Ask the Expert at Big Road Fleet Complete. You click on that site and you're going to see these charts there. If you want to download them, they're free to use. So really, I want to conclude. I'm sure you've come to realize the hours of service rules are complex. In some cases they're similar, in other cases they're different. Depends if they're operating in a province, in a state, if they're going outside the state but staying in the U.S., if they're going outside the state but going into Canada. It creates a lot of challenges. I get a lot of questions about this, scenarios that are asked of me all the time. Generally speaking, the hours of service rules in Canada are a little more flexible than they are in Canada and in the U.S. That's with the exception of personal conveyance. So sometimes U.S. drivers, you cross the border at Fort Erie, you come into Canada, you switch your rules, you're all of a sudden given 2 additional hours of driving, you're given 2 additional hours of elapsed time. The thing you want to be mindful is if you're returning back to the U.S., you're going to lose that time. So if you're over your hours or you're right on the cusp of your maximum, as soon as you're back in Buffalo, you're probably going to be in violation. The same thing goes for Canadian drivers that go south. When you travel to the U.S., you suddenly lost 2 hours of driving. You've lost 2 hours of elapsed time. You need to take the 30 minutes off on the 8th hour of driving in the U.S. But then as soon as you come back and come into Fort Erie again, you can switch back to the Canadian hours, and all of a sudden you've got 2 additional hours. The only thing you don't want to play with is the personal conveyance, because that could bite you. So that's kind of like the final takeaway. It's really, I haven't really talked about ELD. I talk extensively about it in the past. If you have any ELD type questions, we can talk about those. But either way, hopefully you found this interesting. You learned something. If I didn't answer the question, you can ask it right now. I'm going to turn it over to Josh. And if not, you can always reach me at Ask the Expert because I'm not going anywhere. So back to you, Josh.
Great. Thank you so much, Marc. I will now open the floor for our Q&A period, as Marc has mentioned, with the time left that we have in our webinar, about 12 minutes here. Now, we do still have quite a few participants, registrants for this webinar and attendees right now. So if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will email you a response within a few days. Please, in order for us to do this, just make sure to not mark yourself as anonymous when inputting the question, or we won't be able to reach you. Now, let me see here. I do think we have a few questions already that have been submitted. The first question we're actually receiving from Hitesh, and this question is, can deferral rules be used by in an emergency condition only, or can anybody use these rules?
So a deferral rule can be used, number one, only in Canada. So if you're in Canada, you can defer up to 2 hours from day 1 to day 2. It does not have to be in an emergency. If you're in an emergency, essentially 2 scenarios. Emergency 1, you're on the road and your dispatcher tells you, hey, there's an emergency. You can be exempt for hours to get to your place of safety. Number 2 scenario, as we talked about with COVID, specific commodities providing relief. you have it described in regulation, you're essentially lifted from any HOS requirements until that emergency is lifted.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. I do also see as well that we have a question into the chat from Debbie. If a US driver uses US HOS rules in Canada, are they going to be legal?
Well, the answer to that is generally speaking, yes, because in the United States, the hours of service rules are a little bit more restrictive than in Canada. So if they're coming into Canada, they have, as I said, the additional 2 hours of driving. They have the additional 2 hours of elapsed time. What they can't do in Canada, as I alluded to, is if you're pulling a trailer, if you're carrying a load on your truck, if you got a straight truck, and you're relieved of responsibility by your motor carrier, you can't book yourself personal conveyance in those circumstances in Canada. That can only be done in the United States. So hopefully that answered that question.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. I do also see a question from Teresa, which, Mark, if you don't mind, I'll actually answer this one myself. She's
Sure.
asking, she would like to show this to new drivers. Will we be able to get a copy of this? Teresa, so by virtue of you actually registering for our webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the recording of this webinar video. And please feel free to share this with any colleagues of yours who would love to see it. You will have access to this and we'll be able to send this to you within a few days.
The other key point too, Teresa, is if once you present that, share that with your drivers, new and existing drivers, please, if they have any questions, just send them off to Ask the Expert, the homepage at Big Road Fleet Complete. I got my own little button there. Just click on that button and send it to me and I'll gladly answer your question.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we're actually just receiving another question now. Now this might be, let's say, a little bit long worded, but and so it might be more suited for, let's say, a follow-up by email. But the question has come in from essentially, the question is from Yamilet. In the US, could you explain a little bit more about agricultural exemptions?
As a matter of fact, I can. And you could actually find the answer to your question at Ask the Expert, because I have a blog that I've specifically written about that. And because you've asked the question, I will make sure you get a copy of that link. But the agricultural exemption provides a distance exemption. It depends on the type of commodity you're carrying. It depends on what within the radius and you're using or you're hauling the commodity that falls within that category. You are essentially exempt from hours of service. Now, again, much like I said earlier, if you're traveling north-south, as soon as you cross the border into Canada, that US agricultural exemption is not recognized here. So you would have to count your time as soon as you get into, and I'm using Fort Erie loosely, it could be any border crossing in Canada.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. We also do have another question as well that we've just received from Madison. This question is, in the US, you stated during adverse conditions, it adds 2 hours of duty time. Does that also add 2 hours of drive time?
It does, yes, it does.
Okay.
Yep. The only thing you have to be mindful, again, if you're coming into Canada, in terms of drive time on duty, you add 2 hours. What is cut off is your elapsed time. So you go driving time, 13 plus 2 to make 15, 14 plus 2 on duty time to make 16. As I talked about the elapsed time of 16 hours, you cannot go over that. It's locked in right at 16 in Canada.
Thanks, Mark. Sorry, just a moment here. Now, this question we've just received from an anonymous attendee, and the question is there a proper way to use agricultural exemption to be on personal conveyance / off-duty mode? Is there a way for that setting to warn a driver after 172 miles have been driven?
Well, that would be like a point of interest. Like I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're currently a Fleet Complete Big Road customer or not. But in our solution, we have what's called point of interest. So you could actually draw a point of interest from your principal place of business, and you draw the circle point of interest that has built-in alerts. And then once you get close to the threshold, as described in the agricultural exemption, the solution could prompt you. But again, I don't know if you're using our solution or not. And that point of interest would have to be within the United States as well, because as I said, as soon as you cross into Canada, that ag example will not count in Canada.
Thank you, Mark. We also received another one as well, this one from Michaela, and she's asked, can you confirm for Canada rules, which duty status should be used when drivers are taking a 30-minute break? Should they be off duty or on duty but not driving?
To begin, I want to say to the group here today, excellent questions, by the way, and I'm taking these on the fly. So, in terms of the break, what you really want to hone in on is whether the driver is relieved of responsibility or not. So if the driver is going to be not driving and he's taking a break, but while the driver is taking the break, if they're doing something active, and I talked about what's on duty versus what is off duty, as long as they're meeting the requirements of being relieved of responsibility, not doing something active. And really the thing you got to be mindful of, if, like, I'll give you the example, the driver goes to a truck stop and grabs some lunch. And of course he's off duty during that 30 minutes having lunch. And then he says, well, I should maybe go get some fuel now before I take off. And then starts putting fuel. Well, the act of putting fuel is an active duty status. So in this case, if that would have to be claimed as on duty time. The other thing that's really significant with that is the fact that you're going to end up with a time marker. And this is the things I want you to know. Time markers with a date stamp. So if it places a driver doing something, then you have to put him on duty. Otherwise, you're opening up a potential for a falsification there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. We've also received another question as well, this one from Jeff. From Jeff, he's asked, for coach carriers, if you are at a client destination in an amusement park, waiting for the customers to return, do you have to be mindful of the 16-hour rule?
So I'm not sure if the amusement park is in Canada or in the United States, but if you're at a client destination waiting for the customer to return, there's requirements for motor coaches that, again, if you're relieved of responsibility, some motor coaches are equipped with sleeper berths on the back of the bus, where they can just close the curtain and they can rest in the bus. So just follow the golden rule. If you reasonably can take rest, you can move around of your own volition, you can book yourself off duty. In terms of the 16-hour rule, I'm kind of thinking you're probably domiciled in Canada, because there's no 16-hour rule in the U.S. Just think of the sands of the hourglass though, because from the start of your active status at the beginning of your day, as I talked about, you got to count 16 hours forward. And on that 16th hour, regardless of what you're doing in between, on the 16th hour, you got to shut her down. You got to take that core rest of 8 consecutive hours off, and also have 10 in the day. So hopefully that answered that question.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And Jeff's actually followed up confirming that he is located in Canada.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Perfect. Excellent. And there's this one that I can tackle as well. It's from Candace. She's just asking with regard to if there is training for drivers to show them how to use the Big Road app. Candace, we do have this available. This is actually through our Welcome to Fleet Complete portal. We do have quick reference cards, as well as we do have our Big Road support as well, and they can provide assistance for you. We do now have information here, so we can actually direct you through the right links following this webinar. So thank you so much for that question. Perfect. It looks like we are close to time now. I'm just checking to see if we've received any other questions that we've received into the chat, but it doesn't look like it at the moment. Anything else that does come in at the last minute, please make sure to not mark yourself as anonymous, so we know who you are and that we can follow up via email.
Yeah, just remember, I'm not an officer
Yes.
anymore, so I'm here to help you. I'm not here to give anybody any tickets. So if you have any questions, I'm here to help you. I'm very sincere with that. You don't have to go anonymous. I'm definitely going to answer your question.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right.
Now, for everyone, thank you for taking the time to join us today. And thank you, Mark, for, as always, for all of this incredible and excellent information. Now, for everyone, on our webinar still, please take a moment to complete the satisfaction survey in which you will be brought to. Please note, this is really a key step for us to help us better understand if this webinar has met your expectations. As always, thank you so much for your survey responses. And on behalf of Fleet Complete and Big Road, we hope you have a wonderful, safe, and productive day. All the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.